had the privilege of escorting her into a sitting occasion with beloved Adida, and getting to know one another in that really blessed context. And we talked a little bit about writing at that time, just a little bit. And then later, years later, when I had a fairly well-developed manuscript for the book, I approached her through a friend to ask her if she wouldn't give me input at that point. And there's, I'm not going to say more about it because it's a pretty dramatic story in the book.
Right.
So she had, she had an influence. I wouldn't say she instigated the book. It was already a well-developed manuscript by the time she gave input. But so there's an interesting little interlude with Marilyn in the book.
Very much so. So and the publisher, who?
It's self-published.
Self-published.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, in the beginning of the book, you have a disclaimer.
Yes, I do.
And the disclaimer, I don't want to read it to the audience, but you're just basically saying that this is, of the 3 books that I mentioned, there's only one that's considered an authorized story or conveyance of who he is and what the time with that devotee is. So in the disclaimer you say that this is not been an official word of Adidam.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so this is just your experiences.
Yes.
Yeah. So did you ever try in any way to make it official, or you didn't feel a need to do that?
I didn't feel the need to do that. For many years, I had the tremendous honor of being trained by beloved Adida to be part of the team that reviews manuscripts in order to authorize them. And so I feel very well steeped in what those principles are. And he left a tremendous body of work that communicates itself along those lines and is consequently very pure and very powerful. In my own experience, I began to feel that there needs to be a broad range of voice about him. And I began to feel a very personal obligation to share a very human story. And since it's my story, it's a human story, it's a flawed story. And I think there's that Native American tradition in the weaving of blankets that you leave a flaw in the weaving because that's the way the spirit can flow into the blanket. And I feel in some ways that my human flaws that are, I tried to be honest about in the book as best I could, are exactly what might for some people open a doorway to understand why it is that someone would be attracted to have a spiritual teacher, why it would be that someone might be attracted to beloved Adida in specific as a spiritual teacher, what my real human need for him was, and how much I received from him that made all the years with him just so rich and so full of spiritual reward. And I felt that it was important for me to be able to do that in very personal terms, in just very simple and direct relationship with the reader. And I knew that if I felt so many other challenges built into the writing about him, because of his purity, and because of his genius, and because of the incredible power of his blessing, I just didn't feel that I could face the challenge of coming up to expressing those things in some kind of honorable way, as well as exposing my own human flaws and how he served me in the context of my ordinariness, and add on top of that the feeling that I had principals looking over my shoulder, or people who were going to try to apply principles looking over my shoulder. And also, so there was that. And then also in my own background, when I was younger, my family were all very devout Catholics. So I was raised in a tradition, and I have writers in my background, and I have relatives who've written on both sides of the theological fence. They've written official theological treatises that get the official recognition and endorsement of the Catholic Church. And then they've written other things that are just personal testimonials of their faith, and they don't expect or seek any kind of official approval from any kind of religious body. And so I grew up with this awareness that there are two kinds of sacred literature or devotional literature. One that is an official or sanctioned conduit of the Dharma, and another one that's just personal testimonial. And so I wanted this to be very personal.
Yeah, well, one of the things that really I want to tell you that came through for me is that I always looked to that. I always looked for the human side.
Yeah.
In so many books that I read of devotees, it just comes across as just the official word, and it just gets too abstract and it gets too official. It doesn't really get down to the personal matter. And I want to tell for the viewers who are watching this interview, if you want a first-hand, raw account, if you will, unedited and undoctrinated with all sorts of other kind of editing from the officialdom, this book gives you the real story. And the style in which Meg writes is just so smooth, and her craft is she's a master at her craft. So.
Well, thank you, Ed. That's really a very sweet thing to say.
Well,
it's very wonderful to hear as a writer.
It's true. It's true. And so, it will grab you, and just the style and the way you can communicate, how you communicate. And one of the things that I would like to get to now in our discussion is his presence. Mm-hmm. And I do know that you came out of a generation, just out of the beatnik generation, and your father was a university professor and raised in Ohio and moved to Washington, and then we could get into all sorts of stories. You wanting to not take home ec, and
yeah.
the women's lib in you,
Yeah, no, I've been a troublemaker from the start. That's
true. A good troublemaker, a good troublemaker. Breaking the crust off of the culture. But being part of the '60s, being part of that generation of
dinosaurs now is what they call us, Ed.
As Ramdas told me, he said, we're close friends with Ramdas. He said, Ed, I don't know if I'm a relic or an icon.
Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference.
He said, you're a little bit of both.
Yeah.
But anyway, so you're traveling around, you're in communes, you're doing all sorts of experimental kinds of activities in the 60s, 70s, mostly in the early 70s, and you stumble upon somebody who gives you a book. And I was trying to figure out the book it was. Was it The Method of the Siddhis?
Originally, yeah. That was the first book that I got.
Right,
yeah.
right. And so then you come down into San Francisco, you start doing the No Remedy class, you become a student of Arida.
Yes.
You're well steeped in the traditions because you've read not just Animal Farm, which is one of the... Because you come into your studies as a young girl with such compassion, with such a sense of the injustice in the world, the suffering of the world, and not only just the suffering of the world, but also your mind is so developed in the philosophical and spiritual dimensions. You're well steeped in the history and you're not a new student in this. You have done your homework. So when you get to Adidas Community in 1975,
End of 1975 and beginning of 1976, yeah.
and that was in San Francisco, and they had just purchased the land in Persimmons, I believe.
About a year before, yeah.
A year before.
Yeah.
You're doing the coursework. It's a very a dynamic time down then. The community is really together. And I just want to move into the period when you first had the opportunity, because when we're talking about writing, I'm talking about communicating and how you communicate. Your first sitting with Beloved as if you could breathe underwater. And I love that.
Yeah.
Could you, just for the audience, give a little taste of what it was like when you first met Adida, aside from the unicycle?
What you mean?
The
Are you
darshan.
asking when I first sat with him,
with
what the sittings were like?
Darshan.
Well,